We will have a prepared response by Filippo Osella, who is Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at the University of Sussex in Brighton. He is the author of Social Mobility in Kerala, Modernity and Identity in Conflict, and he is also now joining us as the Connaught Visiting Fellow at the University of Toronto.
Secchi's paper addresses tensions ensuing from the articulation of novel forms of sovereignty in contemporary Turkey, which mobilize both secular and religious modalities of political legitimacy, one embedded in the will of the people and the other in that of God. Embodied in the figure of President Erdogan, such an emergent theopolitics, we are told, is constituted by a process of sovereign exception, or purification, if one want to use Zygmunt Bauman's or Bruno Latour's analytics as a prop to Agamben's. A purification of those who do not fit into an imagination of a nation in which full citizenship entails congruence between blood, soil, or territory, and religious affiliation or religious allegiance, here exemplified by the position of religious minorities and Syrian refugees. With such an articulation of sovereignty and the politics of sovereign exceptions it entails are the outcomes of modern disarticulation and subsequent rearticulation of objectified notions of religion and politics and of the role of the state in governing a religion, Secchi's argue that contemporary forms of sovereignty go together and often against the grain of the actual lived experience of living living alongside ethnic and religious others. Democratic practices, that is, are constituted around time-honored practices of exchange, circulation, hospitality, and more, which not only reveal the contingency and porosity of social bodies, but hint towards relational modes which simultaneously mimic, undermine, and exceed formal modalities of sovereignty. Armando's paper takes the story, provides a sort of wider context to Cecil's, in that it takes to task, to me, not only near-hegemonic universalistic understandings or representation of sovereignty in the post-Westphalian state formations, but also of a configuration of theopolitics which draw exclusively from specific Christian tradition and on their articulation with historical polities, in particular in Europe. This, I think, is an extremely important point to underscore, leading Armando to explore early modern pre-colonial configuration of theopolitics within the Islamic world east of Westphalia, from Ottoman Turkey to Mughal India. Two important points, I think, emerge here in Armando's compelling narrative. Firstly, the ways through which Islamic theopolitics drew from complex sources, from Christian Trinitarianism to Indo-kingship. And secondly, how they constitute contingent forms of sovereignty built around fluid and porous notions of political religious charisma and of charismatic legitimation, which, as in Akbar's Mughal India, took on the shape of a cosmocratic polity which incorporated culturally, religious, and politically different populations. Now, both interventions, and I'll start here by focusing first on Armando's, are important because they point us towards the production and articulation of ontologies of power, different ontologies of power, through which a relationship between the immanent and the transcendent are constituted, and then through which possibility of actions and agency are articulated. And importantly, to me, the notion of a cosmocratic polity that Armando employs to talk about the type of polity which is constituted by Akbar rules reminds us, of course, to the type of galactic polities which have been discussed extensively in the past with reference to kingship in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, in particular through the work of Dumezil and Tambaya, for example, Stanley Tambaya, and then more recently in a particular way by Nick Dirks. Now, what is important, something that Armando told us, which needs to be underscored here, is that the configuration of a body of the king and the power of the king is constituted very differently from the way in which is imagined by Kantorowicz, and to some extent also by Marc Bloch in Le Roi Thaumaturge. The sacred touch, yes. In that, the Hindu king, again, there are extremely different traditions of Hindu kingship, so I'm making some very broad generalization here. But what is important here, that the Hindu king always retains an ambiguous relations, an ambiguous status, rather, in that it can be seen simultaneously as embodying the power of a royal deity, of a goddess, for instance, or ruling the kingdom on behalf of a deity to whom the kingdom belongs to. Now, to me, we do need to have some caution here, which in the written version of the paper that I read, of Armando's paper, is suggested there, because Armando begins the paper by saying, well, here we are engaging with an exercise of provincializing theopolitics, and we have to be careful about the hubris of his exercise. Anachronism and hubris of his exercise. And he's absolutely correct. So how do we do this? First of all, we do that by, I think we do it in two ways. First of all, by trying to interrupt the coherence. It seems to me that very often we try to lend coherence to theological arguments which develop over centuries in a way which perhaps is problematic, I would think. I mean, to me, that is one of the main problems of Agamben and those who follow Agamben, for example, by looking at the relationship between early Christianity and modern capitalism, Devin Singh, for instance. Because there is a degree of coherence, there is a disembodied ideas which seems to develop coherently over history to constitute a seamless notion or understanding, in this case, of theopolitics. And I think here is what is important is the work that Secil does in her paper, to look at the way in which understanding of sovereignty are always and continuously exceeded or undermined in different situations by different forms of relationality which do not necessarily, they are related somehow to understanding of sovereignty, but also they draw on a much larger vocabulary and also much larger set of practices based on kingship, friendship, trade. The importance of trade in all this is very, very important. But also I think it is important, that is something that I really like of both papers, is that they bring us to, in the case of Secil talks about particular people doing certain things. And in Armando, it is about the biographies of certain Muslim rulers. Why is it important to think about these very specific contexts? Because it is, in fact, the context is very important here, because otherwise we end up with this notion of complete linearity and coherence. To me, the question is, well, not the question, but what is important that in certain circumstances, the whole notion of kingship, of sovereignty is discussed and is produced with a reference to theology's understanding of a sacred understanding of a relationship between immanence and transcendence, but very often it's simply a matter of bureaucratic rule. This is not just in a process of bureaucratization or charisma. It also happens in sort of pre-millennium Islamicate, where the political is not seen as something which is necessarily a matter of religion. That doesn't necessarily, it's neither here nor there, it's neutral. You just do it, and sometimes it becomes an impediment.